So welcome to Troopers 18. This is our first robot panel. And I apologize if some of your favorite robots did not make the cut. There's just not enough space for all the cool bots out there. So hello, my name's Brian Fite. I'll be your moderator today. And I'd like to start out by introducing our distinguished panel. If you guys were here earlier in the week, you probably, hopefully had an opportunity to hear them speak. But I'll let them introduce themselves. So Brittany, if you could tell everybody about you and what you do.
Sure. Okay, awesome. My name's Brittany, and I am a social roboticist, and I also hack the robots, and I use them to social engineer people.
As if we didn't have enough problems
I'm Davide Quarta. I'm a PhD student at Politecnico di Milano, and I mainly work on system security and moved on to analyze the security of industrial robots.
I'm Lucas Zappa, and I work as a security consultant for IOActive, company in the US. So I basically did a research on robots. I don't have the academic background that you guys have on robots specifically, but I did a research on robotics, and I discovered different problems.
And I think that's good. We want to have that mix, as our keynote speaker today was talking about. So excellent. So just some ground rules. I know this is a big room, and I'm not going to have people running around with the microphones, but this is meant to be an interactive session. So I've prepared some questions to get the juices going there and everybody to kind of, get in the mode. But we encourage you to interact with the panel here in this area, or tonight over dinner, or any of the rest of the week. So with that said, one of the first things I did when Nikki asked me to facilitate the panel was I said, well, robots might mean different things to different people. And, I was fearful of robots. And the more I learn about them, the more I am, maybe that fear is not misplaced. But I asked our panelists what their definition of a robot was. And there were some differences, but I did a word cloud here of where they kind of intersect. And so artificial intelligence came out, actuators, a presence in the cyber and the physical space. Machine was a term that came up a few times. And I think we'd like to start off just to maybe, if I go around the horn here in the same order, and you can maybe tell people what your definition is, and we can pick up on some of the subtleties and where they intersect here. So Brittany, simply your elevator pitch on what, robot.
So after all of the research I've done, how I've defined a robot in the simplest terms is something that has sensors, an artificial intelligence that acts on those sensors using actuators that are all combined into one physical embodiment.
Okay, David?
Well, I actually worked mainly on industrial robots. So for me, it was, before we were talking together and discussing about this, we had a brief call. For me, it was just the standard definition of an industrial robot. You have this multi-purpose manipulator, you have sensors and actuators, but I really, really liked Brittany's definition that includes some AI, because these robots need to be aware of the environment, of themselves, and must implement some kind of planning. So I think this can be a more generic definition that includes also the other kind of robots and not only industrial robots.
And Lucas?
Yes, for me, a robot is simply a machine that has some sense of artificial intelligence and also has a way to move the machine itself, to machine some kind of, to do a movement. So with sensors, he can actually, through the artificial intelligence, move some parts of the body. I think it's that. I was checking at the definition of robot, why the word robot, and I found that it comes from a Czech word, saying that it's forced labor. So it's very interesting to see that it's a machine, used to do something forced that maybe people used to do in the past, and now we can use the machines for moving objects or for doing something physical.
So a machine as a slave.
Yes, he's a slave.
And of course, my terror is that we'll become their slaves at some point. So interesting. The Oxford World Dictionary defines it as a robot as a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, especially one programmed by a computer. So I think we have a pretty good shared definition that should work for our panel. Agreed? Excellent. All right. The first question. are robots machines that people own? Well, that's probably...
So I'll start with that one. So we just went over the definition. We already know that what we're defining robot as. So saying, are robots machines that people own? Well, the answer is no, because that ownership was not part of our definition. So if we're reading it literally,
Okay.
that's the answer to that question in my eyes. I think I understand what you're trying to go with the question is, are robots automatically owned? And I would say the answer is no, because somebody could own a robot, maybe die, and then the robot would be left, but it doesn't necessarily have to be owned by the next person, right? It could just be left somewhere. So robots don't have to be owned at all times either.
So maybe we should, David, what do you think about that?
Well, as any machine, I think they can have an owner, and this might actually open an interesting question. As some of you might know what happened with it was like tractors, I don't know, the business that was trying to avoid people from modifying this equipment.
John Deere.
Exactly. So if you own it, it means that you are also allowed to kind of modify it. With robots, I think you should be allowed to do that, but at the same time, it opens an ethical questions about what you can then let the robot do. I mean, do you need to avoid people that own this robot from making something bad or not?
What I was thinking is that robot machine, everyone has been dreaming about owning a robot, no? Since like 70, 80 years ago. So I think in the future, like maybe probably everyone will own one robot that it will be like his life companion, no? He can share things with the robot and experiences, and the robot might record your life, no? Or hold a history. The thing is that when the person dies, okay, the robot gets erased, and maybe they replace with a new chip or a new database, and the robot itself is, like Brittany says, is passed to another person, no? So I think that now robots, the owner, because if you think about robots, it's not as only social robots. You have industrial, you have others that maybe there is not just one owner that can control it. It can be multiple people that own the robot. You know?
Okay, it's interesting. So on this, go on, Brittany.
So does everybody dream of owning a robot or interacting with a robot?
I think owning and interacting, I think everyone wanted just to have a robot. I don't know if you owning, depending, it's like, what I imagine is that everyone relates robot with future. No? So everyone will want to be, okay, playing around with the robot or having one. If the person is lucky, maybe have one in the future. You know, I think it's nearly the same.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost replace robot with cat, so people don't own cats. They choose you. Robot friends, this idea that you would, have to will property to something. But I think also this idea of where we are today and where robotics or robots will be in the future. I mean, they're not giving Roombas away. You have to pay for them. You might not actually own the rights to tamper with the software. Maybe you should, or shouldn't, as the case may be. But I think that's where our imagination goes. So that might be, I guess I'd challenge you on that, Brittany, that is property today under is Roomba a robot by our current definition. It's a machine. Maybe the AI is the questionable bit there. It has mobility, has sensors, has actuators, and you can own that, and you could will that to somebody in the future. But I think what we're really thinking about are some of the robots that we saw in the earlier slide.
Well, and you actually brought up a good point about robots being social. And that's sort of one of my big things that I focus on is social robotics. And a big part of that is when you deal with a social robot, people perceive them as other beings. They perceive them as other living things to interact with. And the thing that bothers me the most is when you talk about ownership and you hear how people talk about owning robots, and they are going to take our jobs, they are going to, replace us, they are going to do this sort of thing. it sounds a lot like racism, and a lot of that as well. And this is actually something that's brought up quite often when we talk about social robots, is how they are a platform to talk about racism. Especially if you flip back to your original slide, you'll probably see how many of those robots are light colored or white, and the ones that are darker colored are typically bad. But if you look at, especially the ones that are being, there's not many of these are actually real, but that was something I attended last week, the Social Robotics Conference, and that was one of the major topics this year, was how social robots do propagate our racism. So that's why I'm really worried about the ownership language, and why I'm really worried about how people talk about, I want one for myself, I want one to do this for me. It's a really scary sort of comparison to be drawing already.
And the conditioning starting now for the behaviors in the future. Okay.
Exactly.
Fair enough, fair enough. So, I mean, segueing in that, is it intentionally damaging a robot? Is that any different than vandalism? And I mean, we could talk about today or in near future and in the long term.
I guess this is always a matter of the intent you're doing. You're trying to do damage, you're intentionally damaging a robot, but what's your intent? It can be not even a crime, possibly.
Okay.
So for me, again, I'd split it into social robots and regular robots, where a regular robot is maybe one that doesn't display any behavioral patterns and instead is using its artificial intelligence in a very rudimentary way. For example, rice cookers have a crazy amount of artificial intelligence in them to make the perfect rice. I wouldn't call that social behavior at all. So in that case, I mean, if it moved, I would call it a robot. Something like that, I would call it vandalism if you destroy it or something like that. But if it's a social robot and it's showing any sort of emotion or like happiness, sadness, any of that sort of stuff, I would call it actually abuse. Especially because there are a lot of studies on how when people interact with robots, again, they believe they're beings. And even children, when they interact with the robots and they hit the robot, they're like, yeah, that was a bad thing to do. Not that children hit robots more than they do other children, but that's a thing that they cover, is how when children abuse robots, they kind of grow up to be slightly more abusive as well. And that's something to think about, is how we treat robots is also how we treat other people, or will continue to treat other people. So I'd say it's more than vandalism.
So we say some sociopaths, they start out with hurting little animals. So in the future, observation that they're attacking robots, that might be an indicator that they're...
That's actually been studied, and that is a thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Lucas, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think that since we will see more likely robots everywhere, now you maybe see on first world countries, no? But in the future that we will see maybe in other underdeveloped countries, which is more common, like having acts of vandalism, like in my country, in Argentina, it's more common for people to go there and break, for example, windows in the store, no? It's something that is not abnormal. So I think that it is more likely that people will target robots because it's something that is expensive. It's like television on a commercial store. You know, the people that want to do act of vandalism, they target the most expensive stuff. So I think robots, since they will be maybe on the street and that, it will be more likely to be stolen, for example, stolen or damaged. And as Brittany says, it's true that that also affects the people that owns, because they might have like I don't think emotions, but they will have like a connection with the robot. They can have maybe the robot holds a lot of information that is unique, and maybe the person frustrates because all the database is broken, is stolen, and it also affects like in other levels rather than just the money and the economy of the store, you know, because also if the robot gets broken, all the work that the robot is doing, because he's simply a worker in some places, will get stopped, and then they will have to find out a way to just replace the robot, maybe with a person, just trying to hire a security guard, for example, to act like the robot in the picture. No, these are typically like security guards. So they will have to relay back on the human.
And so you're saying society could be affected more than just the thing or the machine or the property or the sentient being is impacted because of what their function is now taken away, the value is taken away from society.
Yeah, yes. If you replace a workforce with robots and you start using robots to do work, I think it's more likely that if some kind of vandalism happens or hack or anything like that, and stops the robots from working in an scalable way, in a massive way maybe, no, it will affect much more because, for example, if in a factory the employees can get a disease, no, they can get sick, and maybe you have 2 or 3 workers that are in home with fever, no. But if this happens in a large scale with a lot of the robots from the same company, you know, that have like an incident, it could affect it could affect robots from all around the world. No?
So rice cookers, okay. Traffic enforcement bots, not so much. Excellent. All right, so we'll start getting a little bit more philosophical here. And I'll start with you again, Brittany. Should we teach robots to lie, and is that ethical?
You know my answer.
I do know your answer.
So I think it is ethical to teach robots to lie, and it is something we should be doing. It is something we are already doing. And some of it is for human safety. One of the first time you asked me this question, my answer was how we treat people in old folks' homes. For example, if somebody has Alzheimer's and can't remember why they're in the old folks' home and they want to ask, like, I want to go home, can I leave, and all this sort of stuff, there are techniques that are used where people lie, and the people watching the elderly people say, you know, this is your home, you are home right now, this is the room you're remembering. And when these robots are put in the same situation, I would say it's unethical for the robot to say, no, you're in an old folks' home, you can never go back to that place. Like, that would be a really shitty thing for the robot to do. So I think it's proper to lie in that situation. And that's just one example.
So David, now industrial robots, do we want them to lie?
Well, definitely not. But I think that's where we should draw the line. And yes, it might be ethical, might not be. Again, what's this machine doing? Where is it put? Whom are they interacting with? If you are interacting with an elder, with a kid, with somebody where you might need to lie, which is something I really dislike actually, because I don't really think lying is a good thing. Sometimes you might use it to avoid doing harm, and that's where it might be used. So it can be fine, but it really depends on where you apply these ethics.
Lucas, what do you think?
I think that while we can teach robots to lie, we still have to remember that we teach it to. I mean, if you program something to lie, then keep track of that you teach this to the robot, you know, because in the future maybe you forgot that you teach to lie and the robot is telling you A and in the end it was B, no? But if you keep track that the robot might lie, no, you can be aware of that. So I think it's like feeding like a machine learning with fake information and telling the robot to say okay, and then the problem is that then afterwards you can lose track of that lie. So while we are aware that the robot is able to lie, it's okay, I think.
So maybe to a competitor,
Yes.
an industrial robot would be programmed to give false information, but to an operator that was
Yes.
required safety, it maybe not a good thing.
And another thing is a lot of these robots are being used for the 3Ds, like dirty, dangerous, and like really draining, are 3 of the things that robots are used for. So one big research area right now is in search and rescue. And so you can imagine robots trying to save people from a burning building. It doesn't really help say, you're probably going to die, but I'm going to try and save you.
Anyways.
You probably want it to lie and say, everything's going to be all right. Follow me. I'll get you out. And even if it doesn't get the person all the way out, at least like it's giving them the right hope for the situation. So lying's kind of important in those situations as well, is to get people to take better actions for themselves.
So I mean, we talked about the class, the purpose, the context. That matters. And I guess today, because we have the sectors are so, they're not bleeding that much over. But in the future, I think all these things might start to merge. And once they have this learned behavior, interesting how we might be able to put that genie back in the bottle, or might not. Yes.
Who should set these ethical rules according to which this robot should lie or not lie?
Yeah, so the question, if you guys didn't hear it, or for everybody else, is, so we've heard some use cases that suggest it might be morally, ethically right to do it and needed for it to carry out its function, but who's going to decide that?
Not the companies. This is something I struggle with a lot when I see a lot of the robots that are actually real. Maybe we'll see some others in the slide deck, but they're often made in really terrible ways with gender bias, especially like cleaning robots are typically female. If you go see Watson in the Computer History Museum, it's got a male voice. The AI controlling the lights has a female voice. So that gets put in these things. You also have situations where like some of the robots have gigantic booties or they have amazing muscles, and it's like, those aren't functional. Why are you putting these on the robots? So you think about how they're just designed. Then you think about how they're going to affect ethics. Like, they can't even design them to not be terribly divisional, right? So I definitely don't want the companies doing it. But then I also don't necessarily just want researchers doing it either. Like, it has to also be people in the wild who are actually operating with these robots. And then there's also the thing about different cultures and all of that. So it comes down to, I also don't want governments doing it. So it's kind of an interesting question for that reason, is hopefully we can all work on it together. But that's kind of the point of panels like these, I guess, is if you have any suggestions, hopefully you can bring it back to academia or propagate it through more industrial conferences, and we can kind of work from there.
And when you say the companies won't, because that's the idea that the market forces, the owners or people who interact with these robots, I'm already starting to develop some politically correctness about dealing with our machine friends or adversaries, as it may be. I guess the question is, if there's nobody doing that today, they'll do it themselves at some point. They'll evolve.
That may be one solution, that they do it by themselves, maybe in the future. But since we're here for a good purpose in network, how about if somebody else is doing it? We do not want them to do it.
So, are there standards out there around? Well, even in our very young science or discipline, morals and ethics are, other than disclosure, we don't have those conversations. I think 2 or 3 years ago there was a great keynote here, and I apologize, I forget the name. I'm old. I'll blame that. But it was all about ethics and morality of some of the research that we do. And that seems to be, those conversations typically don't happen until a science or discipline's a little bit down the road. So in academic space,
I think until society moves, it's not only about researchers and academics. It's more about the community and the social environment that is around. If we are talking like about disclosures, the ethics behind disclosures, until a few years ago, as you were saying, we were starting to talk about this. Now, I don't think we are starting to regulate it now, but before regulating it, there is already kind of a consensus, at least on what a responsible disclosure is, what a coordinated disclosure at least is, and how to carry it. So probably this will happen also for robots and for these kind of ethical questions, but it's society that will set the bar, not regulators, not academics.
Brought up in conversation this week was how it has to be like societally unacceptable for certain behaviors to happen. So if we like put pressure on different companies and say you can't do that, I think that's sort of where we might get some of this going. Like, for example, there were the Carla dolls that were recording children, And that was a thing. And they were outlawed here in Germany, which I was so happy to see. But that was, from what I understand, a very like citizen-based movement to make that happen in the first place, because they just decided it was socially unacceptable. And so you get stuff like that off the market. And I think that's something we've been discussing about InfoSec this week so far. And I think that's what we need to happen with robots too, is that moment where we say, okay, it's not okay for a robot to lie in a sales position and call companies out on that. But maybe if it is in a health or safety situation, that maybe lying is okay. And making that a societal thing rather than a governing board of some sort.
Also, I like the point that Lucas brought up before about like, okay, maybe we are using machine learning to teach something to these robots. Who's liable then for teaching them something? How can you ensure that like the machine learning model, if it lies to somebody, who's liable for this?
We will actually address that in a little while. Lucas, did you have any? But I think what we're in agreement right now is that we're talking about it, but there's no official authority. And right now, if whoever's manufacturing these or programming them or operating them are probably the ones that will have the most influence. I will point out one group. It's called Stop Killer Robots. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's not a joke. And their whole mission is they believe it's morally and ethically wrong to create autonomous killing machines. And so these are autonomous weapon systems that they're essentially trying to boycott and get something like a Geneva Convention, and they've politicked or petitioned the UN to start this. So I suggest maybe that was somewhere we can look at, find out how they're doing it, and maybe we could adopt some of their tactics or even, kind of hitch our train to their effort. Excellent, thank you. Just a quick background on this picture. And the question is, should robots have an expectation of privacy? And this is a Bing mapping car that's being driven around. I thought it was funny that this particular robot's mobility is dependent on a human driver. But should robots have an expectation of privacy?
You mean the privacy of the robot, or the privacy of the people the robot may be observed?
Well, that genie's out of the bottle. This is about the robots. The robots should have an expectation of privacy. I mean, you see bots all the time. Now, I'm assuming this bot is taking 360-degree pictures. Maybe it's also geotagging things, obviously. Maybe it's listening.
Does it have artificial intelligence?
Well, it's got somebody who's probably making less than minimum wage driving it around, so... Okay, so by our definition...
This is not a robot.
This is not a robot. So a robot with artificial intelligence and its own agenda, should they have privacy?
I think they should, but we show in our presentations that current robots, at least, it doesn't. They can't save privacy, no? Because robots have cameras, have sensors, have all kind of audio recording mechanisms. So they have to feel the world. They have to feel the environment. So they capture a lot of information. So the problem with that is that that all this information gets stored on the robot or gets passed through. So somebody that has access to these machines or to these devices, he can obtain this information. So the robot is not like an animal which cannot tell what the animal saw yesterday, for example. The robot saves everything on a way that the human can actually read. No? The animals, they can talk, but we cannot understand. No? Or we can maybe find a pattern on what they are saying, but the robot has the data there, has data that we are able to understand. No? So all the information that the robot holds could affect privacy, I think. So even on industrial robots or even on social robots, all of them have sensors now. And they are trying to put more sensors because they want to get the robot more autonomous, more independent, no, from the human. In some ways, no. In some ways, the industrial ones, they try to evolve by, for example, instead of being more autonomous, they try to work more together with the human. So work more like a partner instead of just a machine that works and does everything on his own. No, but still, if he has to work with a human, has to know, for example, the position of the human, where is it located, how it looks like maybe in the future to identify the worker. No? So all this information is entering the robot. So I think, yes, we should have an expectation of privacy of the robot, but it will be hard.
I believe instead that robots should not have an expectation of privacy, at least until they have a sense of self. I mean, if we get up to this fantascientific level of AI where the robots are actually self-aware, okay, then maybe we should start talking about an expectation of privacy for robots. Otherwise, I think the downsides of expecting a robot to have privacy are like way much more than what you can get by giving it some expectation of privacy. Imagine for an industrial robot, for example, you will need to get access to this data. You will need to, even if it stores, for example, images about the human workers to recognize them, it has models to recognize them, you still need to be able to extract them and analyze them when needed. So I don't think they should have it unless we are talking about something that is self-aware.
Okay, that's a good distinction, I think.
I 100% think robots should have an expectation of privacy, but for reasons of security. For example, if we're in a situation where we believe robots deserve privacy and it should be expected for them, how much harder will we work to make sure they are using like not plain text, to make sure that they are like the data is stored properly, to make sure that it's using updated, upgraded firmware, software, everything. Like maybe these devices will stop being made on shitty technology if there's an expectation of privacy. So, and having that expectation in, then we can hold companies more accountable. We can hold groups that fail to hold companies accountable. But it just creates a whole environment of security first rather than security last if we're making robots have that expectation of privacy.
And one of the things about this that I think of trucks, you know, that have humans driving them, but often there's a number on the back of the truck or the lorry that says, how am I driving? If you detect some kind of odd behavior, drinking and driving, whatever, call this number to report the incident. That maybe is a way to balance the anonymity of the actual specific bot, but with a way to record that.
I also think that if the people don't expect, if the consumer don't expect a feature from a vendor, the vendor won't be, is not going to do it if the people is not going to consume that feature.
The market isn't.
So if the people that is going to have a robot and wants privacy, no, the consumer will have to convince, the producer will have to convince the user that his product has what the person needs, no, what the consumer needs. So I think it's another way of doing marketing, like by using security.
But I still think that it's like if we consider an expectation of privacy as the robot not, let's say, leaking information when this is not expected, yes, they should have an expectation of privacy. But what I was referring to is more like if you want to have data protection, yes, this needs to be enforced, and this needs to be enforced now. So if these robots are based on awful technology, they leak stuff around, that's bad. But at the same time, I expect, for example, being the maker of the robot, being, I don't know, the owner or the user that is using this robot, I would expect to be able to access the data that this robot has, even just for safety or my own safety and security. I would like to know what's going on inside. As long as, I mean, this robot is not like a human being almost, and so it needs his own privacy. You don't want to know what he's doing because he's able to do his own stuff and have his own sense of awareness.
All right. Well, here's the flip side of that one. Should robots be subject to non-disclosure agreements? I recall that we're worried about the industrial spies. Furby could move its ears, but it didn't really have what we call mobility. But yet they were banned from government facilities with a directive from a security standpoint. So what do you think about that one?
Well, I think this raises another question because if the robot is subject to a non-disclosure agreement, who is liable? I mean, the robot is not liable for breaking the non-disclosure agreement. So I think right now, at least, what we should focus on is not if the robot is subject to a non-disclosure agreement, but if who is making this robot is liable for an incident.
So I think liability is a really good subject, and we want to talk about it. But are there any cases of software liability? I mean, we haven't talked about that for a long, long time. I mean, maybe it's different now since these some people will suggest that hardware is more software than actual hardware, and the hardware can't do anything without software. So if something goes wrong, that becomes, puts potentially a precedent-setting case that software liability laws become something that have to be looked at, or at least the enforcement of liability that would relate back to the software. So NDAs, and this would only, a self-aware being, a robot that has...
I hate them for people anyway. I don't think people should sign them. I don't, a lot of non-disclosure for me, yes, there are some critical situations where you probably need them. But for the, bulk of the ways I see non-disclosure agreements used, it's just proprietary. And, I don't know, open source everything, talk more, share more, along with the keynote this morning, we all sort of hide too much of what we're doing from each other, so I hate non-disclosure in most situations anyway. So let's, fuck them,
Right.
Just get rid of them.
And you almost have to show prior art, and it's very, very closely linked to proprietary software, and that's how you would prove damages if somebody violated one.
Imagine, for example, for an industrial robot, it might store some production data, the volume of stuff produced, how many pieces didn't pass QA, whatever. Yes, the robot should not disclose this stuff. But again, it's so if we consider this as a non-disclosure, some condition for a non-disclosure agreement, I would say yes, we need the robot to, say, be subject to a non-disclosure agreement, and somebody should be liable for this. Then instead, if we are talking about software, yes, I completely agree that instead non-disclosure agreements are not something that is going to help in the long run.
I think it would be possible to, for example, sign a non-disclosure agreement even on an industry where you can, for example, say, okay, the robot cannot record this data from this time to this time. No? So I think that will be the non-disclosure. We will be more like non-capturing agreement, without capturing the information. No? Because the robot itself won't be sharing the information. But if the robot captures it, maybe someone can access to this information. But as David said, it's common to collect a lot of information for business purposes. For example, to improve the production, you need a lot of information, to do data analytics on that. But it's very hard to filter the information that the robot sees. You cannot, for example, record video and put censorship on the video before it is being stored on live time, on real time. I mean, it's very hard. But it could be that, for example, that limiting the way that the robot perceives the reality, so that the robot itself is not aware of the full environment. So it only has one vision, like a sensor vision, no? To avoid, for example, faces, to avoid collecting faces or avoid saving that information. Maybe there is a way of changing the way they perceive the reality.
Right, because now most of that captured data is sent to some storage, and they can redact it later on, but it's still there.
I have a paper you need to read that shows vision and doing that sort of stuff on the robots pretty much makes it incapable for them to do their job if they can't see anything. So if you're doing pre-processing, then it doesn't have the enough detail to be able to do what it's supposed to do. But the other thing too is if we're getting to that point where the robot can't even record anything, how do you keep companies liable as well, right? Because I don't know, if we're going to go this far in the future, do we want to prevent robots from being able to be whistleblowers?
Good one. And then this would apply, because a lot of people have to make that decision whether to do what they think is the right thing and violate some piece of paper that they've signed. Well, let's go to the next question then. So, and I'm using owners with quotes here. Do any of the robot's owner's rights convey to that robot or transfer to that robot?
Well, my answer is yes. So a number of things is when you think about owner's rights, what do those all involve, right? It could involve being safe on certain property. So if the robot's on your property, should it have a reasonable expectation of, again, privacy, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, this one's falling pretty dead here. So, okay, here we go. The liability. Who is liable for a rogue robot?
I think the manufacturer first, and then the person that maintains the robot. Because in some robots, for example, they can maintain it in a way like, for example, adding more protections or for example, updating the robot, no? But the robots are not meant to be used only for technical people that are going to use the robot. So I think that the responsibility first is the company that creates the robot, the manufacturers. And then could be, if the robot is manageable and the robot can be updated and all that, maybe yes, it can have some kind of liability, because it's like a computer. You buy a computer and you can do whatever you want with it. No, it's not a problem of the manufacturer if you are doing, if somebody, for example, hacks your computer very easy. They have certain liability, but still it's your problem that you put, for example, a bad password, no? A very easy password. So I think it's a mix. But the end user, the one that doesn't have any knowledge on how to, for example, to use the robot rather than for interacting, no? For interacting with the robot, shouldn't be liable for that, I think.
I don't know, this is not like a straightforward question to answer, because if you think of medical devices, maybe the manufacturer just did part of the device, something else got outsourced somewhere else, and even like the doctor that installs the medical device, in the end, who is liable for this? I mean, there's so many steps that is never going to be easy, I think, to know who is liable for a rogue robot or for something that did go wrong.
So anywhere in that ecosystem or supply chain might be, multiple people could be liable.
Another thing is how do you define what a rogue robot is? Because one of my favorite things in social robotics is the idea of Wizard of Ozing, where whenever you do a social human-robot interaction experiment, you'll have a person interacting with a robot and no one else in the room. But what happens when people interact with these robots is they think they're fully autonomous, even though there's somebody behind the curtain that's teleoperating the robot. And so if you're thinking about these rogue robots, there's usually no indication that anybody else is controlling it. No indicator lights, no messages, no sound. You can't hear what's happening on the other end. There's no indication whatsoever between fully autonomous and fully controlled. And this is something I use all the time in my experiments because people suspend their disbelief. They want to believe that robots are able to be autonomous enough to do some of these tasks. So if you're looking at a rogue robot, how do you even know it's operating by itself? And how do you know it's not being fully controlled?
So that maybe that's why we have to record all this telemetry and data for potential forensics, even if that's not its main purpose, to collect data. Just a real quick note on this. I don't know if you've seen the Oculus program, but this is the best game ever. But it does teach you that you can, hurt robots, so maybe it's bad. Yes, a question here.
I have a question because liability of robots is something I'm dealing with in my daily work when I'm dealing with autonomous driving cars, which in my opinion are just robots driving around people. And there we're having exactly that issue of where you can easily imagine a situation where somebody's getting hurt, especially when a car is driving around. And more or less, when a person is having an accident, it's just, whoever is hurt, it's just an accident and you're done. You have some insurance company paying for it and okay. For a robot, the expectation is that he can make a split-second decision and decide what to do. And we're exactly having this discussions on if the car needs to decide whether he's steering to the left and maybe injuring the people inside, driving straight ahead and maybe driving over an elder woman, or driving right and maybe hitting a child. This is exactly where this liability issue, it's not a rough road, but it's just a shitty situation, but something you have to do. And this is where it really gets present, and for me it's still unsolved. Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the questions I always wonder, I'm going to ask you a question back, is why are we dealing with the same shape of cars? Like if we're dealing with autonomous cars, why are we dealing with something that has like necessarily a front all the time? Like if a vehicle could switch quickly switch backwards instead of necessarily stopping, like could that design change in how we think of a vehicle be the solution to this problem rather than thinking about the ethical and moral problems? Like, why do we have four wheels that only go forward? Why can't we have wheels that go sideways? Like, you know, obviously it's like engineering problems are really, really hard. But design choices, like that's a lot of the problems with robots as well. Even when you're talking about, you know, is it okay for it to look like this or say this or have this voice, is then we need to design it differently so we don't have to deal with those problems. Like, why do robots look so binary? Is this male or female robot? Or why are we even thinking about robots in that way anyway? So could we apply design principles we're thinking to change robots and how we interact with them to cars and how we interact with them and how they work to solve those problems?
Actually, I think that to phrase my grandmother, as shitty as it comes, you cannot imagine. And I'm sure that the car manufacturers in the last decades did a great job to make cars and driving overall more secure. And
With the person driving them and with that in mind.
Driving them, but I think the fact that a machine is driving the car will not change the fact that driving itself, having machines driving around with a high speed, will be completely free of any accidents. There will be cases where accidents will happen. Either because technique doesn't always work, there are issues, or it could be that whatever, there's something lying on the road, a tree from the last thunderstorm or whatever, so things will happen, and we can, by what you just mentioned, try to more or less reduce the amount of the times where it actually comes to that kind of decision. But I'm pretty sure, that's my opinion, that you cannot get rid of the decision itself. Yeah, and more or less, I've been, my brother has been part of a working group exactly working on this. How should computers behave in self-driving cars? And more or less, they came out with not really a decision. They just said what's immoral is if you program into that car things like, if you try to decide, let it that way. If the first priority for the car should be to avoid the accident. And if that's not possible, it should not make any other decisions, because as soon as you try to make a decision, it somehow gets immoral, yeah? Because then you're valuing lives against each other.
Well, and I think another part of this question specifically is what is the point, like why are we determining liability, right? It's usually so somebody has to pay something out or so something changes, and like whether it is design or whether it is law or whatever. And I come from a province in Canada that has public insurance for all the vehicles in the whole province.
Wow.
So how it works is everybody pays into it. Of course, if you fuck up really badly, then you might have to pay a little bit more. But for the most part, it's all just handled by the one insurance company for everybody, for everything. And you just pay your amount every month. So then liability, like, yes, the person at fault usually has to use their insurance, but since everybody's paying into the same insurance anyway, the money just gets shifted. Is that why we're wondering about liability, is who's paying money? Well, maybe it depends on how we're funding the cars, right? Like if we had public insurance for all vehicles and everybody was paying into it, then we just deal with the problems as they come up on a committee or something like that. But then the money can just shift within the same pool.
This might work, but I think, as you probably were kind of saying before, it's also a matter of expectations. We expect these machines to not fail, never, for any reason. They should be perfect and never fail, never hit anything or anyone. This is impossible in reality. So this is one of the things that should be addressed, and it might work. But also the expectations that people have from robots should shift in the future.
So we'll still have lawyers for a while at least.
To the previous slide from this arm movement, so to say, to the robot right movement.
Yes.
What is your judgment with regards to the taxation of the robot labor? It's not child labor, it's robot labor. Okay.
Well, Bill Gates.
Faster thinking than me, really.
Yeah, this was the next one. I mean, and this is the idea of displacement of human workers. I mean, at some point, if we do it right, we all leave the planet, or we have all this leisure time when the automatons make our lives better. But in the interim, some entire classes of workers will be put out of work. And so I think the idea here is that robots themselves might not be paying the taxes, but if they have people who are being displaced, that the value that the companies receive by using automatons, that they'll somehow be able to pay back to society to get us over that hump. So any thoughts on robots paying taxes?
Yep, I believe it depends on what is this robot doing. Is it generating value for somebody, and what this value that is being generated is? Because if it's like money, basically, you are using or abusing the robot just to generate more cash flow, well, this should be taxed. If instead you're using to generate value in the sense that it's making somebody's life better directly, imagine like a social robot or even possibly a security robot, well, no, definitely not.
We shouldn't tax happiness or tax smiles.
No, it's true what David says. I think should be a difference in depending on what the robot does, it should be taxed or not. But I never saw it that way. Like in some cases, some robots contribute society by, for example, avoiding miners to have to enter into the mine. The problem is that these people are used to doing this, and if you one day come with a robot, even though they know that their life will be better because they don't have to enter into a mine, they will still lose their job. No? So, but unless the robots, they start, for example, they will start, the role of the person that, for example, used to do forced labor will shift more into controlling the robot and managing rather than just doing the work by itself. But still, this kind of robots, I think, should pay like less tax than another one which is only made for making money, no, because they don't contribute.
Well, I think that they should not like pay taxes directly, but that's what automation is doing right now. It's like maybe we are investing a lot of money in getting better automation, better robots, more precise robots, faster robots. Are we investing the right amount of money in education to allow people and workers to follow this shift and be able to control them or to program them? So I don't think they should like really pay taxes, but if they should, all this money should be put into education.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies and organizations get tax benefit when they create jobs, but not so much a tax penalty when they get rid of those jobs. And this idea that we have to mind the gap or retool or retrain. And I think I just saw a survey, I don't have it, that it was on LinkedIn, so maybe it's fake news. But that the surveys of the employees, they fully expect that they were going to have to retool themselves, but they're looking to the companies to make that investment. And that may maybe morally and ethically the right thing. I'm not sure that's reality, but time will tell. I almost didn't put this one up, but if we're going to tax them, should robots be able to vote? And this is assuming that I think we've hit that they have, they're among us. Maybe they're a new species, classification. Somebody has a thought on this?
We have been talking so far about the rights, the privacy rights, when they should be able to take life or death decisions. Now we're talking about voting. But we haven't really talked about how we will reach the point of the general intelligence where they will be able to do that. So could you express your opinions on how, mainly, not when, because it will probably happen.
I don't do AI. That's actually one of the most interesting things about what I do is I deal with AI. I don't do any research with it though. They're usually very, very separate, which is why we do the Wizard of Ozing, is because that's somebody else's problem. But it's one of the things where they will mesh eventually. But that's one of the things is right now there is a huge boom in AI, and they're using it to do terrible things. Especially in the States. But when this AI is getting used, like right now they're using it to process data, process patterns. There's not as much on getting them to move properly, because I mean, most of the robots that I deal with, like they have half-hour batteries, then they die anyway. So we need to like improve batteries. We have to improve their composition, their like embodiment, all that sort of stuff. And then we also need the AI. So it's like the two groups have to grow up at the same time. And hopefully we're going at the same speed. But I mean, not being from the AI field, it's hard to tell.
Can I follow up on this? That it seems to me that the conversation is diverging, like generally as we go towards more advanced, like humanitarian, let's say, topics, into something that is not related directly to robotics, but is more like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and how like mass automation, very complex decision making, with applications in the real world because it gets modeled on the robot.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but I think you're considering probably all these questions in a straightforward way, and what we discussed up to now was not only theoretical. As you've seen, there are direct applications, even without such a super AI system, because we can already discuss about privacy expectations. We could even already discuss about voting. A robot might need to take a decision and do some voting. Yes, imagine if you have a system that needs to make a decision even in a production line. Okay, this is actually kind of a voting. There are a bunch of robots. You will take the inputs or the outputs of these robots, and you will have like a voting system
Minority
to decide
report.
what to do next.
That is classification, though, isn't it?
So I think another thing too is like we all forget that so many people have Roombas already, and I know they're not super fancy, but like when we're talking about the privacy stuff, a lot of them already take video, a lot of them already take audio, do that sort of thing. So we already have a proliferation of robots, and I think people continually forget that they're kind of everywhere. Like who doesn't know the word Roomba? In fact, like every vacuum robot is just called a Roomba now because it's just such a well-known piece of language. So we're already dealing with some of these situations when we're just thinking about the robots you already have in your home that can spy on you, that can mess with you, that I used to like steal shit if I wanted. I don't. But that's part of the situation too. Like I think this, like, yeah, should they vote is like a way out there question that even I'm not ready for, and I think for this stuff every day. But yeah, when you want to know when we're going to reach AGI, like artificial general intelligence, do we need to? Because we could have robots like Roombas that are for one specific situation and just talk about them. And there's robots that are great at burger flipping. One actually got fired yesterday because it was too good at its job, which was kind of funny. But we have these specialized robots in all these situations. And the thing we can talk about them in general is things that have the actuators, sensors, AI, and kind of put rules over all of these things without them having AGI. Like I don't think we actually need it right now to start having these discussions.
And maybe there's robots voting right now. We're not even aware of it. So, So what protocol should be adopted for destroying or retiring or killing a robot? Or should there be such a protocol?
This is my jam, so I'll let somebody else go first.
I think that while the robot can hold memory in some way of what the robot did in the past, what are the previous state of the robot, he can still be. The robot still can remember like what he did, no? But when you want to destroy a robot or kill a robot, you have to clear all the memory, all the previous state of the robot. I think that's the only way I can imagine to, for example, to factory reset a robot. Is just clearing everything on the robot that allow him to go to a previous state, no? Because maybe you want to sell a robot. It will be common, I think, in the future to buy a second-hand robot, for example, and you don't know what the robot has inside. So if you have a way of restoring the robot, like killing it because you don't want anything on the robot that can be attached to you or attached to the work he did in the past because of privacy or because of other reasons. I think the protocol to destroy a robot will be to clear the memory of the
Factory
robot.
reset. Or
To reset.
Yes, and then for retiring or killing it, definitely, I think it's already kind of common to have rules for disposing. So being a machine and you need to dispose something that is potentially harmful to the environment, there's already a bunch of laws for that.
So you'll need a
It's
robot
already-
death certificate, a certificate of destruction, so it's not in a landfill somewhere.
Exactly.
Okay, and this is my jam. I'm very excited about this topic. With the social robots, one of the most interesting things is how upset people get when robots are injured or destroyed. One of my favorite examples is there's military exercises with the United States, and they had this robot that had tons and tons and tons of legs, and they used it to get rid of mines. And so what this robot did was like walk over the mines and a leg would fly off, another leg would fly off, and keep going. And they actually, like I don't know military titles, but the guy in charge was like, this is inhumane. We need to stop. And they stopped the thing because it was just too much for them to handle. And there are also situations where like robots will get destroyed and people will send them back to the manufacturer and say, can you fix this? That we need our robot back. And they're like, well, we can send you a new one. It'll be cheaper. Like, no, we need the robot back. And they'll actually fight to get the same robot back. It's like the emotional attachment people have to robots is awesomely insane. I'm getting goosebumps even talking about it. But like, this is a thing, is people get so attached to the robots, like, yes, that's probably the proper way to dispose, but there's so many steps before that. Like, when is the point where somebody actually has to emotionally give up the robot? Like, when do you say goodbye to a friend that you like, I can fix it, we have the technology, like, come on. So it's one of those situations where it's actually very mentally draining on people for a robot to leave their area once they're used to it. There's also examples of the robot that was in a grocery store recently. Like, they didn't program it well. They didn't give it good AI. Like, it was supposed to help people around the grocery store, and people are like, "Where's the cheese?" And the robot's like, "In the refrigeration section." I'm like, "That's not helpful. You're a 5-year-old, basically." But this robot, they fired it, and people were like, "But that's our coworker. Like, why are you getting rid of it?" They got so attached to it. And like, that's like retiring it, right? And people, again, got very, very upset. And even though the robot couldn't do its job, they were so sad. And this is something I deal with rather frequently. If any of you caught my talk on Monday, like one of my friends like made my robot commit suicide in front of me, and it was absolutely traumatizing. Like, they got the robot to like stand at the top of the stairs, look back at me, look at the stairs again, and I'm like, what's even happening? And the robot looks at me again, looks at the stairs, backs up, and flings itself off. And that was like actually really upsetting for me. Like, my robot just killed itself? And I understand somebody else was controlling it, but the act of looking back at me like it's waiting for me to make a decision, like I should have grabbed the robot, like I have lots of regrets with this. But it's a situation where that happens all too frequently. Even amongst other computer science students that I deal with, is everybody gets convinced by the Wizard of Ozing. So many people are like, I love talking to that robot. Just having the opportunity to see it think, make decisions, and have a conversation with me was so amazing. I'm like, it was a script. Like, this happens. And they get attached and like, can I come do an experiment again? Which we typically say no, because once they find out about the Wizard of Ozing, like, we can't do another experiment. So, like, this happens fairly frequently. I've got a question here.
Maybe to this. I mean, if we make robots a better version of ourselves from a maybe ethical standpoint of view, isn't there a real danger that we really like to, I mean, attack rather with the robot than with the human being itself?
Yeah, defectors. Yeah. So is there a risk that human... So I often say that the only thing that'll bring us together is a alien invasion or robot invasion. But he was asking, if we make them a better version ourselves, will we humans potentially defect to the side of the robot and take a robot's position or side against the human tormentors?
Yeah, not really attack the robot side, but isn't there a danger that we like to attack more with robots than with human beings?
Oh, yeah, rock'em sock'em robots. So will future wars be fought with autonomous killing machines? And the answer is, I think, yes. But is that a danger, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, a danger for the social community.
Are you saying, are we going to be better friends with robots than we will other humans?
Yeah.
I mean, I like some of you, but I hate most people. I love spending time with my robots. This is something my lab mates tease me about quite often. But it comes down to the person, right? Like, if the robot's able to provide you enough conversation, then maybe, like the guy up front talking about AGI, like, yeah, maybe if we get to that point. But until then, I mean, there's so many humans in the world. People do weird things. I'm sure there's some people that would get more attached to the robot than the humans. But it's going to be an individual basis.
As long as they lied to me about my weight, I'm happy to have a robot friend.
I think we also do that with computers already, that we give our personality, putting stickers, for example. No, we put stickers, and then it's very hard for us to sell the computer, because it's like part of us. So I think more, maybe in some near future, we will start seeing like clothes for robots, no, for social robots. You can buy already, possibly exist, yeah. So I think that we will continue putting our personality into the robots, and that will make harder destroying or killing, no, because it will have some part of us as well.
Which probably makes them more effective at killing us when we're looking into their eyes and the. Okay, another question?
So wasn't it, from my point of view, wasn't at the heart of the question whether there needs to be a protocol because of the robot? Because everything you said was like related to the relationship the human has with the robot. And, I mean, you said retiring the robot could be bad because the human feels bad. So that's what I understood at least. If we suppose that there is no human that feels bad for the robot, would you just say it doesn't matter, we can kill all robots, so to say? Or,
It's hard to find a situation where people don't feel for the robot. Like, I'd be really surprised. Like, even how we discussed earlier, if people generally don't feel for robots that do display movement or some level of social interaction, usually more on the psychopathic scale. Like, there's a number of papers on this. But even if they don't feel for it, imagine for the person who has to kill the robot, right? Or get rid of the robot. Because that's a situation, too, is like, I mean, some people might like to be the gallows person, but otherwise, like, I mean, that would be a hard situation to be in as well.
Old Yeller, where you have to put your dog down. I mean,
yeah, like, that's not a task that some people might enjoy as well. So there should be a protocol, definitely for destroying, and I think you two covered that very well, is like, what do we actually do with the robot when it's no longer useful? Like, if it actually completely bricks itself, then people will probably understand. Like, I mean, people die, pets die, robots die. So there's a good parallel there. But retiring or killing a robot, like, yeah, retiring feels very much like Old Yeller, or like when people are like, yeah, we sent your dog to the farm. It's like, you know when you're older and you're like, oh, that makes me really sad to think about that now. So it's going to depend per situation, per person, again.
Another question over here. Oh, sorry.
I think currently robots are built more or less in a kind of a human shape, and as they're so new, we all kind of imagine ourselves being in that robot or whatever, and that's why we somehow feel for that. So I would describe it similar to my children being afraid that I'm taking their toy pets away from them. And I'm really hoping that because at some point in time when whatever we've been talking about, whether robots are able to vote, which I imagine that they're self-aware, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. But I'm hoping that this evolution is quick enough, because the point is that you said children grow up and then they realize, okay, these are just toy pets. Yeah? And I'm just imagining if we get used to robots just being scripted, and we might lose that reflection of ourselves in the robot and just saying, yeah, they're just a machine, and if I do not use it anymore, I'm just throwing it away. And in some point in time, they get self-aware again, then they're already in a society which treats them still as a good, although they evolved. Yeah? Hopefully, I made myself clear, although it's a little bit complicated. Yeah?
No, I think that's a good observation, and I'll just speak my thoughts on where Brittany's coming at. That's why it's important to treat them with respect today, so that we don't, when they do become self-aware, that's just ingrained in our behavior, or it's socially unacceptable.
It's more about training society than the robots.
Yeah.
Like, the thing about the children is, if the children grow up abusing them, they'll continue abusing them. So, and when they do that, they're more likely to abuse other people around them and animals around them too. So there's that parallel between all of it. So that's why the treatment is important, is so we're not turning ourselves as a society to be kind of assholes to each other. But the thing is even the ones that aren't anthropomorphic, the ones that are zoomorphized, so like animals, we still see ourselves in Roombas. Like, there's so many great papers on how people believe Roombas are like beings, and how they'll like buy entirely new furniture so it's couple extra inches off the floor so the Roomba can get everywhere. Like, it was a 100-page document about case studies of people doing shit like this, like buying all new fridges. The fridges are 2 inches off the floor. I'm like, that's not a cheap thing to buy. But this is what people tend to do, or they'll name it, or they'll pet it, or they'll put clothes on it. There's actually a number of clothing already. But yeah, so that's a thing that we deal with.
So Gabe?
Question and maybe a follow-up too. So how quickly do you think robots become obsolete? Because you look at like phones and iPads and things, and you're going away every few years.
Oh, what's the life cycle of a robot? Duration. Industrial robots.
Well, at least for industrial robots, the lifetime is very long compared to consumer electronics. You should also consider that this kind of devices costs an insane amount of money. We are talking about like $70,000 for a used one. So, and also you are investing not only in the machine itself, but also in programming it, in making people aware of their functionalities, how to use them. You train operators. There's a huge investment. And it's once they are inside the, let's say, the production line, there's even more than one. It's getting even harder to get like rid of them or change them. So you can imagine these things have a lifetime of 20, 30 years at least. And that's also a problem for security, because as you may think, these are embedded devices. How do they update them? Do they have remote update procedures? How can you update it when it's 24 hours, working 24 hours in a production line? You need some downtime, and so on and so forth. So this opens all these kind of questions. But yes, imagine it's 20, 30 years.
Do you know of any manufacturers with in-house security teams?
Manufacturers, you mean?
Like ABB, the robot manufacturers, the industrial.
The robot manufacturers, yes. ABB was pretty good when we reached out to them about the vulnerabilities we found. They have a pretty good team. They were super quick to respond to our inquiries. So yes, there are a bunch of makers that really care for security. I think also it was maybe Kawasaki or another vendor, bunch of vendors reached out to us also, so they have security teams and they are interested in making their products more secure. There's more than one producer, more than one manufacturer that is interested in security. There are some others that don't really care right now, but hopefully this is going to change.
I think I had a couple other questions. I think I got to jump to the end because we're almost up against it. So, maybe these would be questions we could ask you guys about when is a human that's augmented becomes more robot than human. Will we humans need permission to drive with robots? Should robots have discretion? Which I think we actually talked on a little bit. That voting that may be happening today already about, I have an array of sensors, and they're going to vote to tell me which sensor to trust. But I think this is the question that, we really should end on is, how do we make robots safe? I'm assuming we're helping to do that because that's our mission, to make the world a better, safer place, but...
I think first key is to get awareness of which are the possible threats of robots, the possible things that the robots can do to affect or the physical world or the logical world. No? So once manufacturers or people that work with robots are aware of all the possible risks of having a robot, for example, because it's going to replace a worker, and the robot has to be doing certain tasks and, for example, avoid hurting people or avoid hurting animals. So the way of making them safe, I think, is through educating all the people that is going to work with the robot, that they have to understand that it's not just a computer because it has a physical body. No? So I think it's key to understand this, to understand the difference between computers and robots, and also to integrate security or safety features or standards or anything that is related with safety, but on an early stage of the robot development. Now, when many companies start to produce robots, maybe they start as research. They start researching, they make research robots, and then at the end they say, okay, let's put this out in the market. No? That's, in my experience, what many companies did in the past, because they don't have maybe funding at first, because robots is a technology that is not mainstream, so maybe the manufacturers have to keep up with expectations of people on robots, and they have to invest money maybe in convincing people first that the technology is good. No? So they have to spend a lot of money in marketing, in showing the robot in expositions, doing cool videos. No? So sometimes they don't integrate security on an early stage. So I think that the way to make them safe is to integrate ideas and education and awareness, but when the projects are starting. No? Because afterwards it's too expensive, and even some problems that, for example, we reported, they cannot even be fixed because they don't have a way of updating, or even because the robot is physical. So in order to fix some of the problems, you have to change the physical part of the robot, and that is not possible to update that.
David?
So actually, for safety, if we consider safety and security as two separate things, for industrial robots in particular, there's an insane amount of standards that dictate how you should do stuff, even what are the icons, the LEDs, the way to signal the operator something. They go to a great length to ensure safety. But, at least this is my opinion, things are changing. So, from industrial robots, for example, to collaborative robots, there's a gap that has not been filled, and things are getting worse. Because, as you were saying, we are moving from something that is basically hardware. In the ISO standards, they tell you should have something that is separate to handle safety functions and so on and so forth. What we are seeing instead with collaborative robots is that even safety functions are gradually moving in software, and that's then when security comes in and will help making things safer. So I agree with Lucas that we need standards, education and awareness, but we need also to think of these things not just in terms of safety as something like separate from security.
Safety and security should be one. Brittany, you get the last word.
I think we should keep doing what we're doing here. I think exactly what Trooper's been saying, like, let's make this a safer place. That's step one, is just as we improve security everywhere else, it's easier to improve the security of the robots. And that does help safety a little bit. The other thing, too, is matching user expectations. This is a big problem that we've talked about in HRI, is the idea that as we make robots more social, people are expecting more out of them. And that's not the case. They're not much better. It's just easier to interact. So there's a huge mismatch in how people approach it. We need to fix that, and that's a huge problem. And the last thing is designing for safety. You know, maybe not having robots that scare people, maybe not having robots that are 2 feet taller than people that could fall on them and crush them. Like, what is the least physicality a robot needs to be able to do what it needs to do? So it's keep doing what we're doing here, matching expectations and design.
Excellent. Well, with that, we're up against it on time. I've put the contact information. I think we should continue this conversation, certainly this afternoon, but beyond, and get some of those standards, what works and what doesn't. I would like to certainly thank you all for sticking with us and interacting with us. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished panelists. Let's hear it for them.